a hearty welcome to one and all. This is episode 94 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Tuesday early evening with me. If you're checking out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, click like, subscribe, comment, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch up with this episode on the audio platforms such as Spotify or iTunes, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, turn on those notifications. So a bit of somewhat obscure history. 60 years ago this week, 4 very talented young musicians from across the pond were on their first trip to the United States, and in Miami, to be specific, for a taping of the old Ed Sullivan Show. And while they were in Miami, somebody came up with a bright idea to have the Beatles on the morning of their appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show to go over to the 5th Street gym in Miami and meet a young athlete, an Olympic champion, who was getting ready to take part in a championship sporting event. The musicians were the Beatles. The athlete was Muhammad Ali. And the meeting of these 5 very young men who would one day, all in their own fashion, change the world, is extraordinary. That they happened to be in the same physical space as they were both on the verge of superstardom, global superstardom. Now, the Beatles were already big stars in England, and then they came over here and just hit it huge in the first part of February of 1964. John Lennon was 23. Ringo Starr was 23. George Harrison was 20. Paul McCartney was 21. Muhammad Ali, who was still going by his birth name, Cassius Marcellus Clay Jr., or Cassius Clay, had just turned 22. And they were all so young. At that particular time, it was probably more likely that the Beatles would become global figures and would continue to ascend, because a week before, young Cassius Clay was set to fight the very scary, feared, invincible world heavyweight champion Sonny Liston. 99 out of 100 boxing experts thought the kid was going to get his head taken off. Nobody was expecting the Beatles to come over here and just flail about and not knock everybody's socks off. The music was so catchy. They were attractive. They were just so damn talented. Lennon's ability to vocalize. He didn't necessarily have the greatest voice, but what an amazing frontman he was. And McCartney's skill as a musician, you could see it. And Ringo on the drums. And George, so talented. But when the 5 of them met for this amazing photo shoot, where they kind of each took turns in the pictures embarrassing the other. Like there's shots of Cassius knocking the Beatles out, and there's pictures of them landing punches on him. And then there are pictures where there's not any kind of mock antagonism, where Cassius is dressed in regular clothes and the Beatles are standing around him holding up signs that say future heavyweight champ, Olympic champ, 6'2", 220 pounds, whatever it was. When you think of it, is just marvelous, really. Not only that they were put together, but in their own way, they all knew where they were going. Now, John Lennon didn't know that he was going to become, towards the end of the decade, a very polarizing figure. And certainly young Cassius Clay, before he became Muhammad Ali, could never have known that he was going to become an even more polarizing figure than John Lennon. But when they met and the Beatles were getting ready to have that memorable experience on Ed Sullivan and their first U.S. tour and just tear it up, and young Cassius, a week out from fighting Sonny Liston for the world heavyweight title, whatever nerves the five young men were feeling. You don't see it in any of the pictures or video from that day. And if you don't know who they are, you would know obviously that the big guy, okay, he's an athlete of some sort, I guess he's a boxer. But you wouldn't automatically say, well, these kids must be musicians. They just look like young people having a great time. And when you notice historical moments like this, you know, one of the phrases that I've used and other people certainly used long before me, when a picture is a vibe. And sometimes there are images that make us emotional, even if we've never met the people in the images or the video. They make us emotional because maybe one of the people is gone prematurely, or in the case of the young Muhammad Ali meeting the Beatles, only McCartney and Ringo are still with us. Lennon has been gone for 43 and a half years. George Harrison has been gone for 20. And Ali has now been gone for 7.5 years. And there is a sadness just because they're so young and they still have their whole lives ahead of them when you see these incredible images and video from 60 years ago. There is a beauty and a poetry to it, and there's nothing sad about it. It's just sad and very humbling knowing that you're young, you're at the top of your profession, and very few people are Paul McCartney who can still draw crowds. 60 years later, he can still fill a stadium. That is not normal. Now, obviously, you can't do that in the athletic arena, especially in a brutal sport like boxing. You know, golf, you could be playing on the seniors tour and you could play highly competitive golf for decades. But a sport like boxing, a sport like tennis, you've got a very narrow shelf life. You're not going to be able to do it indefinitely. And I remember an interview with John McEnroe many, many years ago when he had first retired from competitive tennis at that level. You know, then he played on the seniors tour, but I mean from, still playing against the Pete Sampras, Andre Agassi contingent. And they asked McEnroe, because McEnroe, for all of the yelling and screaming and carrying on, McEnroe was a really good student, a very intelligent individual. And I think he got into the same school that Tiger Woods got into, Stanford, if I'm not mistaken. Stanford, obviously, they don't just let anybody into Stanford. It would indicate that you cannot be serious. You know, John McEnroe screaming and yelling at officials. It didn't mean that he was not a brilliant guy. He just couldn't control his temper. But McEnroe was asked a question which answers this notion of young people in one field versus young people in another field. And it's not something that most people would necessarily rattle around in their head. But McEnroe was asked, do you regret not going to Stanford? Do you regret not having a college experience? And McEnroe flatly answered no. And the host, and I believe it was Dennis Miller, and that was the old Dennis Miller Live from decades ago. You know, Dennis Miller had the HBO show in the 90s. And Dennis was really stunned. In his mind, he was asking a softball question, and McEnroe was going to answer, yeah, I really regret that I didn't go to Stanford. I regret that I didn't have a conventional college experience. But what McEnroe said was, I was a tennis player. I was 19, 20 years old. I made the semifinals at Wimbledon. I think he was 18 the first time he made the semis at Wimbledon. Look, the guy was high school age. He was a left-handed Da Vinci with a tennis racket in his hand. The reason why he didn't regret going to college is because a tennis player might only have 4 or 5 good years. There have been all-time greats in that sport who were retired by 27. Pat Rafter, one of the greats, 27, done. Couldn't play anymore, his knees were shot. Bjorn Borg's prime ended at 24. His prime ended at 24. That is mind-boggling. There's no such thing as that in golf unless you incur a serious injury. Tiger Woods at age 19, Tiger Woods at 22, Tiger Woods at 30 is going to be the same golfer unless there are significant injury issues. McEnroe was specifically talking about the time factor of being in that kind of sport. I mean, baseball, same thing, to a lesser extent, but you're not going to be playing. Aaron Judge is not going to be hitting 50 home runs when he's 45 years old. Human body doesn't work that way. Phil Mickelson, still winning majors in his 40s, still had the capacity to win majors in his 20s, in his 30s, in his 40s. It's just different skill sets. Not every singer lasts for decades. Some do, some don't. Look at Bruce Springsteen. Ringo Starr still tours. Ringo had a successful solo career in his own right, not on the level of McCartney. McCartney is a unicorn. He's an outlier. You're not supposed to be able to do what he has done. Maintain your not only your talent, but your will to continue to perform. And look at Elton John, who only recently retired. He was out there crushing it. History tells us that young Cassius Clay, who obviously did not go to college, he went straight from the Olympics, turned pro, and tore his way through the heavyweight division until more or less talking his way into a heavyweight title fight. He did it on talent. He had very wealthy Louisville businessmen backing him and spending money to make the right connections. But he got the title shot because he was just crushing everybody, and he had a big mouth. He had a big mouth. He had a mouthpiece, as they say. He had a platform in that time, and he had a big mouth. And he got under the skin of the world heavyweight champ, who obviously Sonny Liston knew that the kid is talented. They don't give out Olympic gold medals if you knew nothing about him other than he won an Olympic gold. When you think of the level of competition, not just boxing, any sport, any individual sport, the number of people that compete, that strive to make the Olympic team. An Olympic gold medal is never an accident. You're not winning that if you are not stupendously gifted at what you do. So with that, kid wouldn't shut up. Sonny said, I'm going to fight him. I'm going to fucking take his head off, shut his mouth, and then there was a lot of, well, he's a nice kid, go easy on him. He can't punch. But 1 week before that famous fight, there he is, young Cassius Clay, clowning around with the Beatles. Then they start making jokes about we should go on tour together. I don't know how that would have worked. But there was also the idea because Cassius Clay had cut a record. He had an album which was mostly spoken word, but he fancied himself a musician also. And he had a lot of friends in the business. Famously in the movie One Night in Miami, it kind of gets into that. Sam Cooke was a close friend of his, and he did some recordings with Sam Cooke. So you could say that they were in the same business, but he was no more a singer than one of the Beatles could have become a boxer. There's really not that much carryover. And I think of the Beatles, and I am not a Beatles scholar. I am a student of history in general and music history. And to this day, they're certainly considered, top 5 greatest bands ever, even if they didn't have a long tenure. They weren't the Stones. They weren't U2. They didn't have one album after another that they were banging out. And they broke up in the late 60s. And I never got the sense that there was necessarily so much acrimony. There was the idea, Yoko Ono killed the Beatles and all of that. But sometimes people in life get pulled in different directions. And just as the idealistic, rah-rah, pro-America Cassius Clay, not that much longer after meeting the Beatles, he started to see things in a different light and started to not become so rah-rah, we're great, but hey, we can do better. And if I have to fall on my sword to help this country to do better, well, that's what I'm going to do. And in the case of John Lennon, he became seemingly less interested in creating music and more interested in what would be considered humanitarian causes and humanitarian work and speaking out for peace. And this is a situation where, for example, John Lennon and Muhammad Ali met when they were basically college age. And even though their paths were so divergent, they both ended up being significant proponents of the anti-Vietnam movement. Now, in the case of Lennon, because he was British, he was never going to be drafted. He was not involved in the fight. He was just somebody who was give peace a chance. And it's not really an irony, but it's a historical reality that there was a time in the late 60s that both of those gentlemen, who were both gone now, as we say, in the case of Lennon, long gone, were vilified in this country. And in the case of Ali, it was different because of the way he was drafted and the conscientious objection and knowing what they were going to make him do if he did join the military. There were people who were always going to be sympathetic. Hey, the kid's against the war. He shouldn't have to lie and tell everybody how great the war is if he doesn't think that it's great. Joe Louis in World War II believed what we were doing, because he would have done what Joe Louis did if he had ended up going overseas. This was all negotiated and they were trying to get him to come on board, and he wouldn't do it because he could not, in good conscience, look into the cameras at military bases and lie and say, I believe what we're doing here in Vietnam is for the safety of all Americans. Because it wasn't. That was never what it was. But when Joe Louis in World War II looked into the cameras and said, we are fighting for every American. These young men here are safeguarding our future. Joe meant it, and he was right. So there's that. And then there was John Lennon's Give Peace a Chance, where Lennon took a lot of heat, and history showed that he was right. Because Vietnam was the biggest clusterfuck, the biggest foreign policy fuck up probably in the history of the United States. We lost how many people? We had no clear objective. What were we trying to do? Stop the spread of communism? Who gives a shit? What the fuck is the difference? If you think about how dumb it is, it sounds even worse now. Back then, there was legitimate debate. Well, maybe we have to do it because people were panicked about the wrong stuff. But out of context, whether or not Southeast Asia is teeming with democracy, teeming with dictatorship, teeming with socialism, teeming with Nazism, or teeming with communism, what does that have to do with John Q. Public here in America trying to put food on the table for their families? John or Jane Q. Public, I might add. Nothing. Nothing. And at a certain point in time, after Vietnam went completely haywire, more and more people realized Lennon was right. And all of the generals from Westmoreland on down dragging Lennon, he should keep his mouth shut. No, he's giving his opinion. But now you're against his First Amendment rights? Well, yeah, because you don't agree with him, so he should shut his mouth. If John Lennon had become a pro-war advocate, yeah, of course he should exercise his First Amendment rights. I mean, it's the same kind of stuff you see now. Celebrities need to shut up about politics unless they're saying something I agree with, in which case they're just exercising their First Amendment rights. History was kind to Lennon and to Ali. And it is a terrible tragedy that Lennon died so young, that he was assassinated, and didn't have an opportunity to live the kind of life that he wanted to continue to lead. He was 40, for crying out loud. 40. 10 years younger than I am now. Think of the stupendous achievements that he was able to do musically and as a human being. And the thing is, Lennon is a problematic figure because there is a lot of documented, he was abusive to his first wife. It's possible that the saying is, great men are seldom good men. And John Lennon was a great man, but he may have been a scumbag. but he was a guy who was very flawed and did things that were not okay in his personal life. But he also achieved greatness in other areas. And it's, as I've said, I like nuance. Everything doesn't have to be this or this. John Lennon is, to me, a way more problematic figure than Muhammad Ali. Ali had his issues. There's nothing on the boards of him doing the kinds of stuff that Lennon did. There are still people that will take issue, even though he's gone, with the actions during the Vietnam War, draft dodger, coward, like that. That's part of the narrative, the debates that go on forever. But history in general has been very kind to both of them because they took stances that were very unpopular that eventually became less unpopular. And finally, they were seen as visionaries, especially in the case of Lenin, the phrase "give peace a chance," which seemed kind of pathetic at the time when so much of America was pro-Vietnam, rah-rah, because we were sold a bill of goods. It sounds plausible. We have to stop the spread of communism over there or it's going to come over here? Or if Southeast Asia is not stable politically, it's going to affect us how? I don't really think that made any sense ever, but a lot of people certainly bought into it. Look at the pictures of the five guys, ages 20, 21, 22, 23, and 23. Look at the pictures from that day of February 18th, 1964. The smiles, the laughter, the sense of fun, the sense of the world at their feet. What they all ended up doing, each of them actualized their potential. They all led the lives, their best lives, as they could. All were world-changing people. There's no way to write the history of music without George Harrison, Ringo Starr, Paul McCartney, and John Lennon. Generally regarded as the greatest band ever. And if you listen to their, and what a great album, it was called The Beatles Number Ones. It was literally a catalog, a CD of all of their number one hits. Every song is so good. Yes, they're quick, they're catchy, most of them aren't very deep, but the musicianship from such young people. Listen to the song Help. Listen to the way they're nailing every stanza. The talent is off the charts. The energy, the enthusiasm. They changed the world. And young Cassius Clay, in a mostly different way, although of the parallels, of course, with him and Lennon, he became the most famous man in the world. He was the most famous man in the world for at least a decade. He was the first media star, athlete. Michael Jordan before Michael Jordan, and media was not what it would then become. But he had an arc that transcended sports. He was the most hated man in the country for a number of years. When he passed in 2016, he was one of the most beloved figures of the 20th century, warts and all. And the easiest way to see that and understand that, the number of people who you would have thought would have opposed him, who were doing nothing but throwing bouquets of praise from every former president, whether it was Trump, who was a personal friend of him because, some of the boxing promotions, Obama, Bill Clinton, who spoke at his funeral. He had a good relationship with Jimmy Carter. He had a good relationship with Gerald Ford. He worked for George Herbert Walker Bush's administration, for crying out loud. One of Ali's most famous non-boxing moments was during Operation Desert Shield. He went to Iraq, and I don't know how the fuck he did it, but there were some American diplomats that were stuck there, And he convinced Saddam Hussein to let them go in his custody, meaning Ali's custody, and they flew back to JFK. I don't even know how that happened, but that happened. That was one of the reasons why George W. Bush in later years pushed to have Ali get the Medal of Freedom. He said, this guy really, in his own ways, ended up serving his country, even if he didn't do it in the military. Those people were stuck there, and they may have been in danger because Hussein is a fucking madman. And he walked over there, and Muslim to Muslim, he reasoned with Saddam, who was not particularly reasonable. I just think that Saddam had a little bit of a celebrity idol kind of thing going, and Saddam wanted to be his friend. Yes, you may take the Americans with you, sir. God bless you. Well, Allah bless you. Whatever they said. But he went in there, and the history tells that George W. Bush administration said, we don't want you to do this. This is bad. You're not going to get them out, and you're going to make Hussein look stronger. Please don't go, because they couldn't stop him from trying. It worked. He went over there. He got those people out. And it is one of his sort of signature achievements that he was able to do that. His health wasn't good. He was only 48, but his health was already failing. And he was feeling presumably like shit almost 100% of the time. He had that spirit of wanting to do things not just for himself, the spirit of being other directed. As John Lennon, when John Lennon said, give peace a chance, he wasn't talking about himself. He was talking about everyone else. Imagine, right? Maybe the most famous song, the most gentle, one of the most beautiful songs ever written. Think about it. I mean, I'm tearing up just thinking of that song, Imagine, by John Lennon. And there was a documentary that was very popular, which I saw, which is, it's tinged with sadness because of the fact that he was assassinated. And you meet somebody in that documentary very similar to Mark David Chapman, who was a Lennon fan, ended up murdering him. I do get emotional whenever I talk about Ali. And in general, I get emotional when I think of the reality that people that we, in some cases, grew up with, they get old, if they're lucky. In the case of Lennon, he didn't even have the opportunity to grow old, but they die. And we remember them. We remember them when they were young and with their whole lives ahead of them. And those five guys in that crazy photo shoot at the Fifth Street Gym in Miami on February 18th, 1964, all ballers, all home run hitters, all at the top of their respective crafts. But in the case of Lennon and Ali, so much more than just a musician, so much more than just a professional athlete. Maybe they weren't good men. They were very flawed, both of them in their way, but they were both great men. They were men who changed the world forever. And with that, we've reached the end of episode 94 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all so much once again for joining me on this emotional journey back to 60 years ago this week. The Beatles meet Cassius Clay, soon to be Muhammad Ali. But if you caught this episode on the YouTube channel, enjoyed it, haven't done so already, click like, subscribe, comment, turn on those notifications. Or if you caught up with this episode on the audio platforms such as Spotify or iTunes, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, turn on those notifications. I'll be back with episode 95 real soon. Till then, give peace a chance.